This is chapter 13 of Jane Eyre. In chapter 12, Jane is walking to post a letter in the nearby village of Hay. She comes across a dog on her way there, and then a man riding a horse. The man and the horse slip on ice. The man's leg is broken, and then he starts talking to Jane. She helps him, even though he's kind of like surly and angry. She helps him get back to the horse. He asks her where she's from. She says Thornfield. He says, "Oh, do you know who owns Thornfield?" And she says, "Mr. Rochester." And then he says, "Oh, do you know where Mr. Rochester is?" And she says, "No, I've never met him." And then he, she helps him on his way. And then she gets back to Thornfield, and that dog is there, Pilot, same dog. And that guy is there, and it turns out that that's Mr. Rochester. Although he never said, "Hi, I'm Mr. Rochester," he just weirdly asked her about Thornfield Hall, because he's a pretty strange character. So that's chapter 12, and this will be chapter 13. Mr. Rochester, it seems, by the surgeon's orders, went to bed early that night, nor did he rise soon next morning. When he did come down, it was to attend to business. His agent and some of his tenants were arrived and waiting to speak with him. Adele and I now had to vacate the library. It would be in daily requisition as a reception room for callers. A fire was lit in an apartment upstairs, and there I carried our books and arranged it for the future schoolroom. I discerned in the course of the morning that Thornfield Hall was a changed place. No longer silent as a church, it echoed every hour or two to a knock at the door or a clang of the bell. Steps, too, often traversed the hall, and new voices spoke in different keys below. A rill from the outer world was flowing through it. It had a master. For my part, I liked it better. So Jane was getting a little bit tired of Thornfield, very comfortable and nice, but not too much exciting going on. And now there's a little bit of a hubbub, some business going on now that Mr. Rochester is back. Adele was not easy to teach that day. She could not apply. She kept running to the door and looking over the banisters to see if she could get a glimpse of Mr. Rochester. Then she coined pretexts to go downstairs in order, as I shrewdly suspected, to visit the library, where I knew she was not wanted. Then, when I got a little angry and made her sit still, she continued to talk incessantly of her ami Monsieur Edward Fairfax de Rochester, as she dubbed him. So that ami is just friend, so her friend, Mr. Edward Fairfax Rochester. I had not before heard his praenomens, and to conjecture what presents he had brought her, for it appears he had intimated the night before that when his luggage came from Millcote, there would be found amongst it a little box in whose contents she had an interest. So Mr. Rochester basically tells Adele that he has some presents to give her. Adele is super excited about these presents. And then she says some more French stuff. And that must mean there will be a gift inside for me, and perhaps for you too, miss. Mr. Rochester has talked about you. He asked me the name of my governess, and if she wasn't a small person, rather thin and a little pale. I said yes, because it's true, isn't it, miss? I and my pupil dined as usual in Mrs. Fairfax's parlor. The afternoon was wild and snowy, and we passed it in the schoolroom. At dark, I allowed Adele to put away books and work and to run downstairs, for, from the comparative silence below, and from the cessation of appeals at the doorbell, I conjectured that Mr. Rochester was now at liberty. Left alone, I walked to the window, but nothing was to be seen thence. Twilight and snowflakes thickened the air, and hid the very shrubs on the lawn. I let down the curtain and went back to the fireside. In the clear embers I was tracing a view, not unlike a picture I remembered to have seen of the castle of Heidelberg, on the Rhine, when Mrs. Fairfax came in, breaking up by her entrance the fiery mosaic I had been piecing together, and scattering too some heavy, unwelcome thoughts that were beginning to throng on my solitude. Mr. Rochester would be glad if you and your pupil would take tea with him in the drawing-room this evening, said she. He has been so much engaged all day that he could not ask to see you before. When is his tea time? I inquired. Oh, at 6 o'clock. He keeps early hours in the country. You had better change your frock now. I will go with you and fasten it. Here is a candle. Is it necessary to change my frock? Yes, you had better. I always dress for the evening when Mr. Rochester is here. This additional ceremony seemed somewhat stately. However, I repaired to my room and, with Mrs. Fairfax's aid, replaced my black stuff dress by one of black silk, the best and the only additional one I had, except one of light gray, which, in my lowered notions of the toilet, I thought too fine to be worn, except on first-rate occasions. So Jane doesn't really have very many dresses. So this is a step up from her usual dress, and she only has one more dress that's kind of above that. And notice too that they're all black and gray, sort of dreary color scheme for your nice dresses. "You want a brooch," said Mrs. Fairfax. "I had a single little pearl ornament which Miss Temple gave me as a parting keepsake. I put it on, and then we went downstairs. Unused as I was to strangers, it was rather a trial to appear thus formally summoned in Mr. Rochester's presence. I let Mrs. Fairfax precede me into the dining room, and kept in her shade as we crossed that apartment, and passing the arch whose curtain was now dropped, entered the elegant recess beyond. 2 wax candles stood lighted on a table, and 2 on the mantelpiece. Basking in the light and heat of a superb fire lay Pilot. Adele knelt near him. Half reclined on a couch appeared Mr. Rochester, his foot supported by the cushion. He was looking at Adele and the dog. The fire shone full on his face. I knew my traveller with his broad and jetty eyebrows, his square forehead, made squarer by the horizontal sweep of his black hair. I recognized his decisive nose, more remarkable for character than beauty, his full nostrils denoting, I thought, choler, his grim mouth, chin, and jaw. Yes, all 3 were very grim, and no mistake. His shape, now divested of cloak, I perceived harmonized in squareness with his physiognomy. I suppose it was a good figure in the athletic sense of the term, broad-chested and thin-flanked, though neither tall nor graceful. So Mr. Rochester is kind of distinctive looking, very grim, very square features, both in his face and then in the set of his body. Mr. Rochester must have been aware of the entrance of Mrs. Fairfax and myself, but it appeared he was not in the mood to notice us, for he never lifted his head as we approached. "Here is Miss Eyre, sir," said Mrs. Fairfax in her quiet way. He bowed, still not taking his eyes from the group of the dog and child. "Let Miss Eyre be seated," said he, and there was something in the forced stiff bow, in the impatient yet formal tone, which seemed further to express, "What the deuce is it to me whether Miss Eyre be there or not? At this moment I am not disposed to accost her." So Mr. Rochester doesn't say that, but his tone is very dismissive, and it seems to suggest to Jane at least, I don't really care that this girl is here, I don't want to talk to her right now, whatever. I sat down quite disembarrassed, so Jane is not embarrassed. A reception of finished politeness would probably have confused me. I could not have returned or repaid it by answering grace and elegance on my part. But harsh caprice laid me under no obligation. On the contrary, a decent quiescence, under the freak of manner, gave me the advantage. Besides, the eccentricity of the proceeding was piquant. I felt interested to see how he would go on. So Jane's not embarrassed, she's not put off by this, she's just kind of curious about why this guy is so weird. He went on as a statue would, that is, he neither spoke nor moved. Mrs. Fairfax seemed to think it necessary that someone should be amiable, and she began to talk. Kindly as usual, and as usual rather trite, she condoled with him on the pressure of business he had had all day, on the annoyance it must have been to him with that painful sprain. Then she commended his patience and perseverance in going through with it. "Madam, I should like some tea," was the sole rejoinder she got. So poor Mrs. Fairfax just trying to make conversation, say, "Oh, you must have had such a hard day, Mr. Rochester, especially with your leg being sprained." And he's just like, I want some tea. She hastened to ring the bell, and when the tray came, she proceeded to arrange the cups, spoons, etc., with assiduous celerity. I and Adele went to the table, but the master did not leave his couch. "Will you hand Mr. Rochester's cup?" said Mrs. Fairfax to me. "Adele might perhaps spill it." I did as requested. As he took the cup from my hand, Adele, thinking the moment propitious for making a request in my favor, cried out, "Isn't it so, sir, that there is a gift for Miss Eyre in your little chest?" "Who talks of cadeaux?" said he gruffly. "Did you expect a present, Miss Eyre? Are you fond of presents?" And he searched my face with eyes that I saw were dark, irate, and piercing. "I hardly know, sir. I have little experience of them. They are generally thought pleasant things." "Generally thought, but what do you think?" "I should be obliged to take time, sir, before I could give you an answer worthy of your acceptance. A present has many faces to it, has it not? And one should consider all before pronouncing an opinion as to its nature. Miss Eyre, you are not so unsophisticated as Adele. She demands a cadeau clamorously the moment she sees me. You beat about the bush." So Adele's like, "Hey, don't you have a present for Jane?" And Mr. Rochester's like, "Did you expect a present?" And Jane kind of gives this very politician-like answer where she's like, I don't know, a gift has many faces, and I have to think about how I'm going to answer you. And Mr. Rochester says, oh, you're not like Adele, who just like instantly demands a present. Because I have less confidence in my desserts than Adele has. She can prefer the claim of old acquaintance and the right to of custom, for she says you have always been in the habit of giving her playthings. But if I had to make out a case, I should be puzzled, since I am a stranger, and have done nothing to entitle me to an acknowledgement. Oh, don't fall back on over-modesty. I have examined Adele, and find you have taken great pains with her. She is not bright, she has no talents, yet in short time she has made much improvement. Ouch, Mr. Rochester. So he just says like, oh yeah, Adele has no talents and she's not very bright, but you've done a good job teaching her. Very odd compliment. Sir, you have now given me my cadeau. I am obliged to you. It is the meed teachers most covet, praise of their pupils' progress. Humph, said Mr. Rochester, and he took his tea in silence. Come to the fire, said the master, when the tray was taken away, and Mrs. Fairfax had settled into a corner with her knitting, while Adele was leading me by the hand round the room, showing me the beautiful books and ornaments on the consoles and chiffoniers. We obeyed, as in duty bound. Adele wanted to take a seat on my knee, but she was ordered to amuse herself with Pilot. You've been resident in my house 3 months? Yes, sir. And you came from Lowood School in Blankshire. Ah, a charitable concern. How long were you there? 8 years. 8 years? You must be tenacious of life. I thought half the time in such a place would have done up any constitution. No wonder you have rather the look of another world. I marveled where you had got that sort of face. When you came on me in hay last night, I thought unaccountably of fairy tales, and had half a mind to demand whether you had bewitched my horse. I am not sure yet. Who are your parents? I have none. So Mr. Rochester, he asked her how long she's been at Lowood. Jane says 8 years, and he was like, oh my God, I thought half that time would have ruined anyone's constitution and health. So it's commonly accepted that many of schools like Lowood are not the greatest living conditions for their students. So then he says, oh, I wondered, that makes sense why you look like you're from another world, because not the greatest living conditions in Lowood. He says that he was reminded of fairy tales, which is very similar to Jane being reminded of Bessie's nursery stories and fairy tales when she met him. So he asked her who her parents are. Jane says, I have none. Nor ever had, I suppose. Do you remember them? No. I thought not, and so you were waiting for your people when you sat on that stile. For whom, sir? For the men in green. It was a proper moonlight evening for them. Did I break through one of your rings, that you spread that damned ice on the causeway? I shook my head. The men in green all forsook England 100 years ago, said I, speaking as seriously as he had done. And not even in Hay Lane or the fields about it could you find a trace of them. I don't think either summer or harvest, or winter moon will ever shine on the revels more. So Mr. Rochester goes, oh, were you waiting for your people on that road last night alone? And she's like, what people? And he's like, the little green men, by which he means elves. So he's basically saying she looks otherworldly and like an elf person. And then instead of being like, you're really weird, she just responds with like in the same vein of thought. And she's like, no, yeah, the elves are all gone from England. It'll be a long time before... They weren't here for a long time, and I don't think that they'll be back anytime soon. So she kind of takes his weirdness in good stride. Mrs. Fairfax had dropped her knitting, and with raised eyebrows, seemed wondering what sort of talk this was. Well, resumed Mr. Rochester, if you disown parents, you must have some sort of kinsfolk, uncles and aunts. No, none that I ever saw. In your home? I have none. Remember that time when Jane told Mrs. Reed, I will never call you aunt again? We're kind of seeing that here, because she's not saying, yeah, I have an aunt, Mrs. Reed. She's just saying, I don't really have a home or any family. Note too that Mrs. Fairfax is incredibly confused by what's going on. They're talking about green men on roads and things, and she's just like, what is happening? But Jane and Mr. Rochester seem to understand each other and joke around a little bit. Where do your brothers and sisters live? I have no brothers or sisters. Who recommended you to come here? I advertised, and Mrs. Fairfax answered my advertisement. Yes, said the good lady, who now knew what ground we were upon, and I am daily thankful for the choice Providence led me to make. Miss Eyre has been an invaluable companion to me, and a kind and careful teacher to Adele. So finally, Mrs. Fairfax can jump back in on the conversation and says what a good job Jane is doing. Don't trouble yourself to give her a character, returned Mr. Rochester. Eulogiums will not bias me. I shall judge for myself. She began by felling my horse. Sir, said Mrs. Fairfax, I have to thank her for this sprain. The widow looked bewildered. So Mr. Rochester was joking around again and saying, oh yeah, I have to judge this girl for myself. She made my horse fall down. And Mrs. Fairfax is very confused again. But we know that he's joking, kind of just playing on this idea that she's like an elf or fairy person. Miss Eyre, have you ever lived in a town? No, sir. Have you seen much society? None but the pupils and teachers of Lowood, and now the inmates of Thornfield. Have you read much? Only such books as came in my way, and they have not been numerous or very learned. You have lived the life of a nun. No doubt you are well drilled in religious forms. Brocklehurst, who I understand directs Lowood, is a parson, is he not? Yes, sir. And you girls probably worship him, as a convent full of religiouses would worship their director. Oh, no. You are very cool. No. What? A novice not worship her priest? That sounds blasphemous. I disliked Mr. Brocklehurst, and I was not alone in the feeling. He is a harsh man, at once pompous and meddling. He cut off our hair, and for economy's sake bought us bad needles and thread, with which we could hardly sew. That was very false economy, remarked Mrs. Fairfax, who now again caught the drift of the dialogue. So Mr. Rochester says, oh, I bet you all worshipped and respected Mr. Brocklehurst. Jane very honestly is like, nope, not a good guy. And she says he tried to save money by doing all these things. Mrs. Fairfax thinks that is ridiculous. And was that the head and front of his offending? Demanded Mr. Rochester. He starved us when he had the sole superintendence of the provision department before the committee was appointed, and he bored us with long lectures once a week, and with evening readings from books of his own inditing about sudden deaths and judgments, which made us afraid to go to bed. What age were you when you went to Lowood? About 10. And you stayed there 8 years. You are now then 18? I assented. Arithmetic, you see, is useful. Without its aid, I should hardly have been able to guess your age. It is a point difficult to fix, where the features and countenance are so much at variance, as in your case. And now, what did you learn at Lowood? Can you play? A little. Of course, that is the established answer. Go into the library. I mean, if you please, excuse my tone of command. I am used to say, do this, and it is done. I cannot alter my customary habits for one new inmate. Go then into the library, take a candle with you, leave the door open, sit down to the piano, and play a tune. So he kind of bosses her around, and then he stops himself, and he's like, oh, I'm not used to being polite. I departed, obeying his directions. Enough, he called out in a few minutes. You play a little, I see, like any other English schoolgirl. Perhaps rather better than some, but not well. All right, so he's just as honest as Jane is. I closed the piano and returned. Mr. Rochester continued. Adele showed me some sketches this morning, which she said were yours. I don't know whether they were entirely of your doing. Probably a master aided you? No, indeed, I interjected. Ah, that pricks pride. Well, fetch me your portfolio, if you can vouch for its contents being original. But don't pass your word unless you are certain I can recognize patchwork. Then I will say nothing, and you shall judge for yourself, sir. I brought the portfolio from the library. Approach the table, said he, and I wheeled it to his couch. Adele and Mrs. Fairfax drew near to see the pictures. No crowding, said Mr. Rochester. Take the drawings from my hand as I finish with them, but don't push your faces up to mine. He deliberately scrutinized each sketch and painting. 3 he laid aside. The others, when he had examined them, he swept from him. Take them off to the other table, Mrs. Fairfax, said he, and look at them with Adele. You, glancing at me, resume your seat and answer my questions. I perceive those pictures were done by one hand. Was that hand yours? Yes. And when did you find time to do them? They have taken much time and some thought. I did them in the last 2 vacations I spent at Lowood, when I had no other occupation. Where did you get your copies? Out of my head. That head I see now on your shoulders? Yes, sir. Has it other furniture of the same kind within? I should think it may have. I should hope better. He spread the pictures before him and again surveyed them alternately. So he's looking at, he's kind of trying to see, I guess, what Jane's skills are. So he asked her to play piano. He says, oh, it's okay. And then he says, Adele showed me some drawings. Are they your own? And Jane gets a little offended, and she says, of course they're my own. She brings them to him, and he's kind of just looking at them and examining them, asks her where she got her copies from. and if she had help from anyone else. So she says, no, these were all my own creation, and they also came from my own head. So I didn't look at a picture or a model of anything. They're created by me and by my imagination. While he is so occupied, I will tell you, reader, what they are. And first, I must premise that they are nothing wonderful. The subjects had indeed risen vividly on my mind. As I saw them with a spiritual eye before I attempted to embody them, they were striking, but my hand would not second my fancy, and in each case it had wrought out but a pale portrait of the thing I had conceived. So if you do any sort of artistic work, you often experience the same problem that Jane's describing there, that the image you had in your head is sometimes not what you can actually execute. So what she imagined was better than the actual paintings, but she's going to take some time to describe them now. So that's what that my hand would not second my fancy means.